Hey there, class, and welcome to Module 2. This week, we're going to be covering gentrification and digital mapping. We're going to be applying digital mapping to some specific examples, and this week, it's going to be gentrification. And I would like to just share a story about how I personally have gotten to know gentrification. And that's mostly been through living here in the city of Philadelphia. I've also spent a lot of time in the city of New York, Brooklyn in particular. For some time, I was dating somebody in New York, and I was spending a lot of time there. Um, so when we're thinking about gentrification, we want to be thinking about who the different stakeholders are. People are positioned in this very differently. Our classic way of looking at gentrification is a rich versus poor thing or a black versus white thing. But I would like to introduce a little bit of social scientific theory here to add to that, right? Because though the rich versus poor thing and the white versus black thing is a big part of it, but there's also a real estate aspect to it and an economic aspect to it. One of those in particular, one of those social scientific sort of frameworks that are useful is what is known as the rent gap. And in another video, I'm going to talk more specifically about the rent gap and show you a chart to help you visualize what we're talking about with the rent gap. But the idea essentially with the rent gap is that real estate will disinvest from neighborhoods over time. And then something like redlining can also accelerate that. First, I want to, before we get into the rent gap and redlining, I want to take a few steps back and just talk about, make sure we're all on the same page about gentrification. So the sort of common conception of gentrification is that it's when we've got wealthier people and also typically white people moving into a neighborhood, an urban neighborhood, and in so doing, raising the prices, raising the rents, the property values, the property taxes that homeowners need to pay, and also introducing new culture to the neighborhood. And that might look like coffee shops, that might look like cat cafes, that might look like fancy bars with lots of different types of beer on tap, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, of course, we all want nice things, and some of those things are maybe pretty nice. Some of them may be kind of extra fluff that not everybody cares about, but we all want nice things. We all want our trash picked up in our neighborhoods. The issue with gentrification is that oftentimes people get displaced. Oftentimes the neighbors, usually more poor neighbors and also usually more proportionally non-white neighbors, are getting displaced, those who had been living there before. So back to the ideas of rent gap and redlining. So redlining is something historically that has driven gentrification to a degree. I want to go to this next slide here just to show you an example of redlining. This map that you see on the slide is a map from 1937. It's from the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. And so this was a time in the United States when mortgages were becoming a little bit easier to get. Prior to that, it was a bit harder to kind of get on that ladder of owning a home until the Home Ownership Loan Corporation came along and made that a bit easier. And so this map is from the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, and it shows the different neighborhoods that they color-coded different colors. And you can see some of the neighborhoods they color-coded red, others other colors, right? So the red neighborhoods are those in which at the time were predominantly Black neighborhoods. And those predominantly Black neighborhoods were deemed neighborhoods that were unfit to get mortgages. So people living in those neighborhoods had a much harder time owning homes because they just couldn't get mortgages from the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, the main vehicle of people getting mortgages at the time. So we can look at this and recognize that this is quite racist policy. It's very racially exclusive zoning policy and mortgage policy. And we can also observe the effects, the legacy effects that have reverberated through time because of the lack of intergenerational wealth that families have been able to accumulate and pass down to their children over time. And so we still see those effects. But the reason I want to point this out is this was the early 20th century version of setting the stage for the types of urban changes that we're seeing today, in which we're seeing people that need to leave neighborhoods, displacement happening because of property values rising and rent rising, et cetera. People who were not able to receive that intergenerational wealth from their parents and grandparents haven't been able to keep up with the rising rents, the rising property values, and therefore get displaced. So that's the connection between gentrification and redlining. And I also just want to show this picture of the neighborhood of Point Breeze, Philadelphia. Point Breeze is, those of you unfamiliar with Point Breeze, some of you might be familiar with the neighborhood of Point Breeze. It's in South Philadelphia. And it's a neighborhood that has been, over the past 10 years or so, very characteristically experiencing gentrification. A lot of people are experiencing displacement, and we see this contrast between these architectural styles here. Right here on the right, we see this brand new building. I'm not sure how long this type of architecture is really going to last. I don't know. We'll kind of have to wait and see in 20 years what the conditions are looking like. But we see a lot of this stuff going up around Philadelphia. Typically, it's taller than the rest of the block too. It's very unpopular. A lot of people don't like this sort of drab gray, very just sleek looking, but also oftentimes people claim it looks boring. I might agree. I won't say whether I think so, but actually I'll just say it. I think it's boring architecture. And then on the left, we see the older architecture. And so this is just a pretty visual contrast that we can see in which there's a difference in the new homes versus the old homes. The new homes have a much higher value, and therefore it will cause the values of the older homes to increase, the property taxes people need to pay there and the rent that people need to pay there. That becomes a problem for people that have tight budgets. Anyway, I want to talk about, I'll talk more in depth about rent gap in another video, but essentially rent gap is when the price between what the rent currently is and what a landlord can potentially get for that property. When that gap happens, that property is sold and then redeveloped. And you can see it happening here in Philadelphia, for instance, in Point Breeze. Right now I live in University City, and here in University City, there's also a lot of that going on, in part because of the universities here, Penn and Drexel, kind of driving that process. I also used to live in South Philly, so I did observe some of that happening in Point Breeze as well. And it's happening in Northern Liberties, Brewerytown, Fishtown, Kensington. In New York City, it's happening in neighborhoods like Harlem, Crown Heights, and Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. And the gentrification there not only took place because of white folks, but also because of Black folks with money coming from places like Atlanta. With some Black families do have the wealth to invest in real estate, and that also can be a driver of gentrification. I mean, it's usually white families, but it sometimes can be Black families too doing it. So it's race is a big component of this, but there's a little bit more. There are more layers going on. It's a class thing as well. And so these folks are coming in, they're displacing other people, but do they like all of the parts of the culture that exist in that neighborhood? Usually not. Usually they're calling the police on parts of, on aspects of the culture already existing in that neighborhood that they don't like. There's a good example in New York City, in Harlem. There's a park that was experiencing very drastic property value hikes, and prior to those property value hikes, there was this drum circle, mostly of Black people, who every Saturday would go do a drum circle. Kids would be playing, and these drum circle people would be keeping an eye on the kids. It was a really cool tradition that was happening in that park every Saturday. But of course, when these very expensive condominiums started to get built right around the neighborhood, and the prices started rising, wealthy neighbors started moving in, they started calling the police on that drum circle. That drum circle had existed there many years prior to those new people moving in, but when they moved in, they didn't like that part of the culture. It was too noisy for them. They saw it as a threat, perhaps, and they started calling the police. So that drum circle tradition came to an end, unfortunately. And that's an example of sort of the cultural impact of gentrification. So anyway, we're talking about different layers here. It's a complicated process, but it's important to understand it. And digital mapping can be one tool through which we can understand this process. There's people that already own property and land. Sometimes people that already are living there who own property do make money when those property values rise. So it's not always a blanket negative effect. Some people who have been living there for generations like it when property values rise. So again, it's a complicated thing. Additionally, when a neighborhood is gentrified, it typically sees more trash picked up. The buildings look nicer. The city invests in that neighborhood more. So the question really that we should be asking is, can this development happen without displacing that culture and the people there? So this is something for you to think about and something that we can continue discussing.